everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this event. So this panel discussion is titled Leading Unions in Precarious Times, Women of Color Talk Gender, Race, and Class During COVID-19. It's sponsored by the Teachers Work Teachers Union Special Interest Group of the American Educational Research Association. This event is the final panel sponsored by our SIG this year, and we would like to thank you for joining us late on a Sunday, for East Coasters at least. So we are so pleased to host 3 panelists today, and I will let Theresa Montano introduce our panelists. I'll pass it over to you, Theresa.
Great. So we have an exciting and awesome group of women of color leaders in educator unions today, sharing their voice and their experiences in negotiating COVID-19 under this neoliberal culture. Joy Lachica from all the way from Canada. They'll each introduce themselves as we get started. Jen Johnson from Chicago and Cecily Myart-Cruz from LA. We're going to get started right away with the panel because these women, I know you're anxious to hear from them. So the first question I'm going to pose to each of them is, if you'll give us a little bit of background in who you are and tell us a little bit about what got you involved in working with educator unions, why unions and why you? And then what role do race, class, and gender play in informing your leadership and your organizing? And I will start with Cecily.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cecily Myart-Cruz. I'm the president of United Teachers Los Angeles. I am the first woman in 30 years as president and the first woman of color, Black biracial woman in 52 years since the inception of UTLA. I've been teaching for 26 years. I've been a part of the union for 26 years and active for 25. Really active on the local, state, and the national level. So why unions? Why not? We need to be actively involved in our union. And I wanted to have a space where we were actively trying to push boundaries, especially with women leaders. Role of race, class, and gender informing my leadership. I'm a classroom teacher. Middle school is my jam. And what I would say is students really center all of the work that I do. So it's based on students, what students are bringing, what they're saying, how I'm listening, how I'm using those conversations to propel myself forward in the movement, as well as the union. Race, class, and gender play a huge role, especially as our teacher ranks, educator ranks are primarily women. But when you look at unions, they're male-centric and mostly white male dominated. And so to be in a situation where you have your workforce that's heavily dominated with women, but your union force is heavily dominated with men, there is this patriarchy that happens and continues to happen that really, I believe, stifles where women leaders can go and grow within the union.
Thank you, Cecily. Jen, same question for you.
Thank you so much for having me today. I am Jen Johnson. I'm the Chicago Teachers Union Chief of Staff, and this is the 18th year that I have been either working in the school district in Chicago or at the union. I was a classroom teacher for 10 years. And I've been working at the union now going on 8 years. I also identify as a Black biracial woman. I'm an only child. I'm the daughter of a public school educator who was a Black male in Grand Rapids, Michigan. My dad is a 35-year veteran of that school system. And over the course of his career at his school, he watched the school go from multiracial to predominantly and almost exclusively Black. So his experience as an educator colored my childhood. He was a working class guy from Alabama who got a college degree and kind of was able to join the middle class due to being an educator. I saw him become a pillar of his community and an influencer and a change maker. And that made me kind of see education as the only natural path for my life. The union thing was an accident. And I always tell this because my dad and I only had a conversation maybe a year or two ago for the first time about him being a union member. He's been a card-carrying member of the Michigan Education Association since he began his career, and he still pulled out the card in his pocket of his retiree membership, but we never talked about it. And I think that for me, it's important. We have to talk to our students about what it means to be a union member. No one talked to me about it. The only reason I became active in the Chicago Teachers Union is because there was a small number of very active, progressive, multiracial, multi-age, mixed gender group of individuals who decided that the union had the most praxis to make change, and specifically to fight on racial justice issues like preventing the closing of schools in Black communities. And so I was identified by others who were passionate about racial justice within the union space. I was a delegate, but my role in the union at that point as a rank and file leader was not informed by much of an analysis other than kind of protecting public education. And so there were others who saw the union's power and saw the size of the union and the platform that the union had. And intentionally, we built a caucus whose foundation was built around the idea that the union had to do more for racial justice. It had to be a more accountable voice for the students and families that the union served, even as the teaching force has whitened. And so I'm a consummate educator, but my union leadership only came about because I care about racial justice and knew people who cared about racial justice. And so I would not be on staff at a union where that was not the case and where we were not building anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-sexist structures. We have a long way to go. But that is why now I am a union leader, because I believe the union can be a space for those racial justice issues. And it comes from the foundation of the example of my dad. And yet my dad never talked about being a union leader. So plenty of work still to do.
Joy, what about you? What role do race, class, and gender play for you?
Thank you. And I am Joy, and I'm coming to you from the territorial lands of the Anishinaabe and close to the area with the dish with one spoon. We want to always acknowledge our Indigenous forebears here. And so I'm just coming to you today from our Democratic convention. The NDP had a convention, and I come inspired because it's just amazing to see how educators, unionists, and in the political realm, we can really come together to have hope in the midst of this leg of the pandemic. It's been a terrifically difficult time here in Canada. If you notice anything that's happening to the north, we're experiencing probably the greatest spike that we ever have had in terms of the variant. And we have infections and ICU admissions that are really skyrocketing. So in terms of the prevalence of the infections and the pandemic, it's really eclipsing our rate of being able to have a vaccine rollout that's making sense. So my role as a union leader I am now supporting the Elementary Teachers of Toronto. It's been a path for me that's evolved. I've been a teacher since 1989. I'm a middle school teacher as well, 7th and 8th grade, all the way through for more than 25 years. And, that's where my heart is. And it's so wonderful to talk together about really students being at the center of everything that we do, and families and community. And that's what's been building the organizing that's surrounded this very challenging period for everyone in this pandemic. My time in the classroom, starting teaching in the early 90s, it was a lot different then. In Canada, in Ontario, and education is jurisdictional based on province, there was a lot more that teachers had. Classrooms were smaller. There was a lot more support for students. And then over 2 decades, we began to see how austerity, neoliberalism, governments that have come into power that are very conservative and increased privatization all around. And that's become the agenda of government. So we've just seen erosion and cuts to education that have been mind-boggling. So we've enjoyed coming to you, coming to Labor Notes, being inspired by Chicago and LA and all that you've been doing to begin to organize around the things that we've been losing. That's what drew me to unionism. Since 2015, I've been elected to represent Toronto members. I had a term as president of the Elementary Teachers of Toronto, and I currently sit on the ETFO provincial executive, where we're making decisions as we speak about what we're going to do next in the face of this ruthless government. So excited. In terms of race, gender, and class, I stand with you who have spoken. I'm Filipino biracial, and it hasn't always been easy. I've grown up in all white communities where I've been the only one that's been different. So we experience our oppression in different ways. I love the way that in our progressive communities that we can begin to look with just with a lens that's intersectional. That we have multiple identities. I am not only biracial Filipino, I'm also queer. I have a partner and family and a daughter that's 10. And we just have so many things in common. And as unionists, we can come together in many ways and find what we have in common to build and organize and fan the flame. So that's where I am. I continue to face challenges because of my identity in terms of what Sister Cecily said earlier about the patriarchy. And even though unions in Ontario are made up of 80% women, we're still working hard to make sure that our representation aligns with that. So it's still always a struggle, but we fight the fight and we work hard to be more represented in all of our diversity and in all of our color. Thanks.
Thank you. And in the words of an LA activist, having women of color in leadership is not just about a change in leadership, it is a change maker. So we thank all of you for your work. I'm going to move to Jen this time for the first question and rotate the order. So the second question is, what are the primary challenges or difficulties that local teachers, educational workers, and the greater community where you're situated have faced under the COVID-19 pandemic? Jen?
Thank you. So, the premise from which all of our organizing in CTU comes from the last decade is the idea of pushing for the schools Chicago's students deserve and a just Chicago. We didn't have the kind of schools we needed or the kind of city we needed before this pandemic. We were already dealing with communities that are overly saturated with trauma, poverty, unemployment, schools that are under-resourced. And so, we had already been fighting for the staffing that our schools need, for building community schools where all stakeholders are involved and engaged in making a school an anchor of a community. We're a part of community coalitions, building political power to pass progressive legislation and to push for progressive movements in housing in particular. So the pandemic has really just proven that this is the kind of work that unions have to be doing all of the time, particularly in diverse locations, in locations where the students that we represent do not have adequate resources and stability in their homes. So like, I think that's the first thing that we need to say, is that COVID exacerbated what already was happening. You know, the way I would describe COVID is just this period of sustained loss, complexity and hardship on families, and instability, but that it didn't start with COVID, right? We have children who are killed by violence, police or street violence before this pandemic. And we saw a 13-year-old killed by police officers in Chicago last week, but it's not new due to the pandemic. We saw a young woman, Zamaya Bell from Simeon High School, who passed away because of COVID, but because she had underlying conditions in her health, right, that impacted her and made her more susceptible. Those problems existed before, and we have not solved them, and we don't have a laser-like focus on, especially I think in teachers unions, on addressing those systemic problems to the extent that we need to. And we're seeing, because of the fact that we have national and international networks, right, that we're building that. I have talked to Toronto educators before for years. They have talked with us. I know Cecily, UTLA and Chicago talk all the time. And so we're building the kind of responses that we need, and we have been over the years. So I should focus just a tiny bit more on the actual question, but so it is to say this period has exacerbated problems that already existed. Women were already overburdened in our membership with childcare and parenting demands, but they are now in a position of, in some situations, having to choose, do I quit my job, or do I take an unpaid leave of absence from my teaching job because I cannot get adequate childcare coverage in this moment. We have families, right, who are facing eviction. We have a hospital that was attempted to be closed in the Black South Side that community members had to fight to keep open, right? So the challenges are in some ways the same as they have been before the pandemic, and the pandemic has merely worsened them and brought them further to the surface. So I think it just reiterates the need for us as educators to be utilizing the platforms that our unions have to push for, bargaining for the common good, for working in coalition with community, with students, because the problems that existed before are still going to exist after this pandemic, and they're merely going to be that much worse. So, coalitions around recovery are going to be vital.
Thank you. Joy.
Thanks. So we have challenges around consultation on a regular basis. I mean, this has just been such a dynamic and unfolding year. And the government continues just to make announcements that are profound in terms of what our lives look like, what the teaching platform and classroom is, without consulting with appropriate stakeholders, without even speaking to boards, without speaking to the federations, the teachers' federations. So it's a huge issue, and it just impacts us greatly. Lack of funding for resources, equipment for online learning, lack of funding for internet, high-speed internet for families, even for teachers, a sudden pivot to virtual learning that's just happened, and it's happened over and over. And I know with you all as well, throughout this year, and no preparation, no funding, yet at a podium, the government will say that they have provided all that. So these are the things that are just exasperating for educators. Similarly, childcare issues. As we're in virtual school, or when bricks and mortar teachers are forced to pivot to remote, we have teachers with babies in the hip, and 2 and 3 and 4 children, and with their own children that may have, special learning needs, and they have absolutely no support for that, but yet have 36 students in front of them on a screen, asked to synchronously learn for 300 minutes a day. So it's not safe, it's impossible. And yes, teachers teachers are having to make huge decisions about, you know, whether they can work. So we're facing some of the same things. We find that there's no threshold that our government is using, like in terms of a number threshold for opening and closing of schools. We find it's very willy-nilly and inconsistent. What an outbreak is might be 6 students at this school, but it's 12 students at that school. And what neighborhood is it in that they declare the outbreak? So there's some of these divides. And, you know, when we have our equity lens, we can connect the dots and see that there is systemic issues going on. And and yet there's hardly enough time to be able to even address them. I think time is a big challenge. The time that we have to leap from one obstacle to the next and try and troubleshoot and resolve it. And collaboratively, sometimes it's a rush, and we find that we're chasing our tails or we're getting tired. I think leadership gets tired, and we're going 24/7, almost like we're paramedics, but there's no one to take the next shift. And you know, you just go on adrenaline because your members are needy and you're trying to do the best you can. Lack of centralized coordination in terms of a vaccine rollout. It's just amazing with your new governance and President Biden and Vice President Harris, just to see how everything has shifted and things are going 100 miles an hour. We don't have a similar thing going on here yet. It's very piecemeal, regionally, provincially. The coordination isn't in place, and I think that's part of the reason we are where we are. Paid sick days, lack of paid sick days for families of students in our schools. This is part of the reason we have more widespread incidents of the variants. You know, teachers are working hard, they can't afford to not be at work, and they're trying to support their families. So we need to have workers with paid sick days, and we're fighting hard for that in our unions and with our allies and other affiliates.
Thank you, Joy. And Cecily, talk to us about LA. You're muted, Cecily.
And I knew that was going to happen. So I was saying, like, these sisters are speaking and they're like bringing up every single issue that we're discovering here in Los Angeles. Like, it doesn't matter where we are, the same issues. Like, I was just talking to my colleague Arlene, and we just like, I'm like, this is exactly what we were just talking about on the telephone. So what I'll offer is, I'll try to like get in. You know, this past year has been eye-opening for all of us. The pandemic has caused us to come really face to face with all the inequities that have existed in our society and within our schools. And in order to actually address these inequities, we have to find meaningful solutions, and we have to acknowledge that they exist. Once we do that, then we can work together to be able to fix them. So we have to actually acknowledge that this stuff is real. So when my sisters are actually saying we have an issue with childcare, that is not an issue just for LA or British Columbia or Chicago. That is a global issue, and it just doesn't affect educators. It's our folks in the meat packing plants to the folks cleaning buildings, the high-rise buildings. It is a global issue. And when I say that we live in a patriarchal society, patriarchy is going to try to smash down on women. And one of the ways is to use laws against us. And this issue of childcare is so visceral for so many people, because it's making this confrontation with your soul to say, am I going to give up my job? Or am I going to go in the building? I have a decision to make and I want to do both. But the society, the law, the district is saying, no, you can't work remote because we live in a patriarchal society. And so that means we've got to talk about this issue and really bridge it to a bargaining for the common good issue, that we are fighting not only for educators, but we are fighting on the front lines for every single woman and every single guardian, because it could be a trans woman that needs childcare. And damn it, we have to do it. So that is something that's a larger issue that we're going to have to work together in coalition with community groups to lift this up and say, this is an issue, not just for educators, because that's what we are seeing in the papers. Oh, they're lazy. They don't want to go to work because they need childcare. It's like, you're asking us to do something impossible. Leave my kid at home to come to work? Like, that doesn't make sense. So that's happening in LA as well right now. And, you know, and we're trying to work on it, but it is hard. A couple of other things that, you know, were said, you know, I think educators have been painted, you know, first people are painting educators as superheroes and, oh, educators are great, they're doing this. And then when the rubber meets the road, you know, months into this, then they're like, get your butt back into the brick and mortar building. We don't care about science. The CDC said this, and under the former administration, they said this. So y'all should be able to come back. And then it became that mantra of the lazy teacher. And Joy, you brought it up right from the beginning. When we went to remote learning, when we, look, LA on March 11th told our superintendent, the governor, and the mayor, y'all need to close schools. All three of those men said, let's just wait. So our union held a press conference on March 12th and said, close the thing down. On March 13th, the schools were closed, and that helped other districts around us to close. I know we saved lives. I know we saved lives by closing the schools down. We did that. We're not going to get credit right now. We may, in 10 years, get credit for that. I won't hold my breath.
Thank you, Cecily. Well, thank you all. We know it has been difficult in these times, and we do look to leadership from our educator unions for the entire community. Joy, I'm going to go to you for the last question, and then folks, I'm sure that you're got lots of questions that you're reflecting on, so we'll open it to the floor after this. So the last question, Joy, can you describe how the union's response, what was the response to the difficulties? And can you tell us a little bit about your successes and your challenges?
Thank you. So our union, as many of you may know, we have the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. That's our umbrella organization, our federation with 83 teacher locals within it. So in Ontario, we have these many regions with their own independent teacher locals, some rural, some urban, some very far in the north, some south. And so, you know, it's how COVID has unfolded in different areas at different times has just been wide ranging. And so certain hotspots have emerged. I'd probably 10 hotspots, and mainly around the Golden Horseshoe of Southern Ontario, but you know, also in pockets in northern areas, depending, because we know how it's impacted long-term care, and that can be anywhere. So the Federation has been having to just really be connected to all the locals to find out what their needs are, and then push back. There have been weekly meetings with the Deputy Minister of Education. So there's a great deal of pushback and discussion and bringing things to that large round table on behalf of Ontario. And there have been tremendous things come from that in terms of ETFO fighting for what we need through open letters, petitions, and on a local level. The Elementary Teachers of Toronto have 11,000 members, and we have been the primary hotspot in terms of the prevalence and the density and how it's impacted neighborhoods to huge degrees, racialized neighborhoods, and we've really fought for through petitions. 1,000 teachers did a petition around we must have vaccines, we must have asymptomatic testing, and you know, it's taken time, it's taken lots of raising voices and shouting from the rooftop and working within our various wards in our city of Toronto. But teachers have come together and really tried hard, despite how exhausted they are, to take direct action. With their principals. We do work refusals. That's something that we can do. Our right to refuse unsafe work, that's been happening. And we've been getting, we've just been making some traction. And now teachers, the government bent just a few days ago and has agreed to vaccinate teachers, to make it a priority in this break. We're having spring break right now. Over the break, to have teachers be vaccinated, and asymptomatic testing happening from mobile units in Toronto. That's been promised. Now we have to hold them accountable and make sure that they actually come through with that. Because that's another thing they tend to do, is they'll say things, but then we won't see it unfold quite the way we've been told. So it's a constant fight. Press conferences, media scrums. All of our teacher, we have a Catholic teacher local in Toronto. We have secondary teachers with their own affiliate. We have ETFO and we have the French as well. So we've been doing joint press conferences, and that's been making a huge difference. The volume that all the teacher affiliates coming together can amp has really made an impact in terms of things starting to shift. A whole lot to do and a long way to go yet. Thanks.
Thank you. And Cecily, same question.
Thank you for that. You know, here in LA, you know, educators, parents, students, community members work throughout this pandemic to really ensure that our school reopening was based on science and safety. I cannot say enough for our bargaining team led by Arlene Inoue for really doing a hell of a job to get us where we wanted. We were based on health and safety. We fought tirelessly to ensure that all educators and school-related personnel were given access to being fully vaccinated before returning into the school building, that proper PPE would be distributed to all those who entered the school building, and that stringent social distancing protocols are maintained, and that the return be based on COVID-19 spread in the community, not just in the school building. That was so, so important. And as I look back, I say, I'm an expert of 26 years teaching. And when we closed the schools, it was a necessary step so that we could eradicate this. And our district actually agreed with us. Our superintendent worked hand in hand with us. We educators were not the ones standing in the way during this pandemic, because there are 23,000 Angelinos who have lost their lives to this tragic disease. UTLA worked on the front lines with families and parents and from community members to create a plan that centered science and safety. And the one last thing that I want to talk about is that we're in a new normal. And we must plan on fighting for more investment in our schools, in our students, and for our classrooms. And that means fighting for our classrooms that are equitable no matter where you live, whether you're whatever your race is or your creed. And that's what we have to be focused on, what it looks like coming in, that we need to have a healthy, healing, racially just return into the school building.
And Jen, final question for you.
Thank you. You know, similar to LA, well, not similar to LA, the opposite of LA, more like Toronto. We had in Chicago to close our schools. We had to argue for that. We called press conference with our community partners, and thankfully, you know, the state leadership has shown a little bit more adherence to science and ultimately closed the schools across the state. Initially, the work with the school district was supposedly grounded in the notion of grace, empathy, and flexibility. These were the words that we would hear out of district leaders' mouths. And so in the spring, after the initial shutdown, we came to some terms of agreement. You know, people were pivoting on a dime, trying to figure out how to do their jobs completely differently. And so that phase, I would say, was a little, it was shocking, it was jarring, but it wasn't the same, there wasn't the same urgency that there then came to be as the summer progressed and then we saw the fall COVID spikes, right? Initially, everyone was just like shocked about what was happening. Schools closed and our district, you know, to some degree allowed our educators to figure this out without putting too many restrictions around it. But like I said, as things evolved, I would say the union had to respond in 3 different arenas. One was this notion of constant bargaining. So we came to some terms in the spring, but as the next school year came about, it became clear the district wanted to try to make things more normal again, right? The idea of grace, flexibility, and empathy went out of the window. And so over the course of this school year, constant bargaining ramped up and ramped up and ramped up, right? Where we got to the point of elementary educators nearly being forced to take refusal action massively, right? It wasn't exactly a strike because we weren't saying we won't work. We're saying we're working and we want to keep working from home because COVID is spiking massively in the winter. We ultimately avoided members refusing on a mass basis, but many individual members were locked out of their virtual classrooms due to fighting for a safety agreement for elementary schools. If we had not done that, there would not have been any actual plan to vaccinate educators. That's something that we won in our agreement. We did not win what LA got, which was the notion of people being fully immunized before going back, but vaccination wasn't even on the table at that point. I would say then the second big area of work that really emerged and has been constant besides bargaining, and now we're embroiled in a high school fight right now. I left our House of Delegates meeting, so I don't know what they voted on for tomorrow for high school. So forgive me if I'm stressed out about that, but our members have shown they are engaged. Oh my goodness. COVID has shown that people will come to a union meeting online. They want to learn about how to be better virtual instructors with one another, and they are willing to organize electronically. So the member engagement and activity has been incredible. The number of union meetings over the course of this phase has been powerful. So I think if there's something else to learn, right, is that we have to be willing to organize in different ways. And the virtual space is actually not that bad. And so members have been deeply involved. We had a 3-hour House of Delegates meeting last week with over 600 people on it. On Thursday, we had a virtual meeting with 1,500 members on it, right? The people are tired. I am exhausted, but they are still engaged because this is so important. It has been the hardest pivot of their lives, and they care about the details of how it affects their students, themselves, and they are engaged like mad. And then the third area I'd say our union continued, right? It wasn't new. is coalition work. We have really important coalitions that we have with other labor unions. So for example, the Grassroots Collaborative. We also have an independent political organization called United Working Families. And then we have our community coalition called the Grassroots Education Movement. And so none of the work that we've done in terms of bargaining or member engagement has been absent or disconnected from what students, families, and community organizations and other labor leaders are thinking about. So, during this phase, we actually won, the Chicago Teachers Union won our bargaining rights back in the legislature, right, during this period, because of the groundwork that had already been laid in terms of building political power, building coalition power. So I would say those are the ways that we've tried to respond. Constant bargaining, it's still going to keep going. Even if we, land something around high schools in the next weeks, we're going to constantly having to be updating our understandings of what our work looks like. And then constant member activity. We've got 25, I'd say, committees. They've been active during this phase. The housing committee helped fight for housing legislation. The testing committee is fighting against standardized testing. And like I said, union meeting attendance and engagement involvement has been great. Who knew car caravans would be a thing too, right? We've had incredible attendance at those. And then again, coalitions. We can't do this work alone, and we did not, and we have not.
Thank you. We're going to open it up for questions in the chat. And the first question, I'm just going to throw it out there to any of you. And the first question is, or all of you, with the gross racial inequity exposed by the pandemic, talk about, okay, now it just hid. Talk about how in your experience as women of color, how you fight for a racially just return to on-site learning.
I'll go. Yeah. I think the biggest piece, and I don't know, it would be good to hear from Jen and Joy. I feel as a woman, I need to listen. And that's what we do best. Listening, to hear, and to understand. So I actually wanted to hear what was going on with folks with the childcare issue. As a single parent of a fourth grader in my district, like I know the trappings of what we've done, on Zoom for this whole year. Been highs and been lows, been in betweens, right? And so I think definitely listening, but I am looking at other students and I'm talking to student groups. And one of the things that I'm hearing students say is they want educators to do more in the way of decolonizing the curriculum. And it harkens into my mind that we have to actually build anti-racist educators, because now with folks coming in to buildings, we don't want our students to be criminalized for not having their mask all the way up and so forth, right? Doing these kind of things that you would just as a, like put your mask on or so forth and so on. Like we've got to be patient, we've got to be flexible, but we've also got to really center our babies in this work. And when we talk about this racially just return, like what does that look like? Do we actually need SROs and school police on school campuses? I would say not. If we're actually talking about liberation and liberation for our kids, what else does it look like? It looks like ethnic studies as a right and not a privilege. And when we talk about ethnic studies, I'm not talking about heroes and holidays. I'm not talking about cultural diversity. I'm actually talking about liberated ethnic studies. So like, those are just right, those are the things that I want to see as tools for educators to have that and be able to ascertain how to, with professional development or peer groups, to read and to discern so that we can move forward with anti-racist educators.
Thank you, Cecily. Let me pose the next question, and either Joy or Jen, if you'd be willing to answer this one. I'd love to hear any advice for folks who are not in fighting justice-oriented unions. What might we do? Where might we begin to get things moving? And again, throw that out to any of the three of you to begin conversation on that.
Sure, I can jump in, and I just want to echo some of the things that Cecily said too about a racially just return. Like I have to just be honest that I'm cynical because we're not going to get everything we need, and there is no winning in a global pandemic. It's about survival. And so, the way I've been thinking about how we're fighting is what more can we get? Because at this point, political leaders, our mayor, our school district, they don't care about maximum safety. They don't care about maximally meeting the needs of our students. They're willing to do the minimum, right? So we're actually right now fighting for 16-year-olds and up who are eligible to get vaccinated in our city and to work with students to become ambassadors for vaccination in our communities, right? During COVID, at least close to 20 high schools ultimately voted to remove the school resource officers from their schools because students rose up and organized and educators supported them. But we still have, 75 other schools that still have police officers in them. So I want to both be honest about the opportunities presented and where we are pushing for more, and be honest that our kids are going to go back to school without everything they need. Federal dollars is a really critical point right now, right? There is federal money coming into our school districts. And if we are not working with students, parents and families in order to provide a roadmap as to how that money is spent, it's going to be spent on standardized testing and temporary workers who aren't going to be there forever. And it's not going to create unionized positions. It's not going to create community schools, right? So we have to be the ones saying, this recovery is going to be long-term, and we have ideas about what the vision of our school districts can look like in coalition, right? So it's not just the teachers union going at it alone. And then in terms of advice for where to begin, there's so many great resources. I would start with things like labor notes, the United Caucuses of Rank and File Educators, books like the labor notes book on CTU, like the Black Lives Matters at School book that just came out from Rethinking Schools, and the Social Justice Teachers Union book that just came out. I might be mixing publishers. One of them is Haymarket, or both of them are Rethinking Schools, right? One of them's Haymarket.
Haymarket.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, and I'm sure any of us on this would be willing to give our contact information and be in touch later, because this is honestly being in coalition with people from around the country. There are familiar faces on this call and people I don't get to talk to enough. It's how I get energy, because being isolated in our own spaces can be draining. We can forget that the fights that we're banging our heads up against constantly are the same fights that everybody else is going through. And we are building the kind of social justice and racial justice vision for unions, teachers unions especially. And so it's about getting plugged into those existing networks. The other thing I would say is, if you don't have, I see my researcher colleague, Sarah Rothschild, on this Zoom, if you don't got an amazing researcher who does crunch the numbers for racial and social justice and economic justice, you need to get a researcher. Find a member, find a researcher who knows how to look for the data that supports us, because the powers that be always love to bash us with evidence that is nonsense, right? So shout out to Sarah for being here and for being awesome.
Thank you, Jen. And the next question, Joe, I'm going to pose to you, but again, open it up to any of the three of you to answer. Have you been able to leverage support from parents, especially parents of color, in your pandemic-related advocacy? If so, what advice do you have for local leaders who are struggling with mostly Caucasian parent groups pushing to open school buildings and blaming the union for kids not being in classroom 5 days a week? So I'll start with with joy, but I'm sure Jen and Cecily have a lot to say on this one.
Thank you for the question. There are lots of layers to that. And one thing that I can say is we've gleaned so much, you know, as Jennifer talks about coalition building, just in terms of our parents in the city of Toronto. We saw in the last year walk-ins for education, so that, you know, in a wide range of wards within our city, parents of every background coming together and walking in to protest the cuts to education in a positive and celebratory way with students. So a walk-in as opposed to a walkout, that was really successful, and it spread. We were able to share some of that throughout the province, so that in more rural regions and in the north, different teacher locals were able to use some of those strategies and to begin to build those parent coalitions. But I have to say, we still have a long way to go. You know, I don't think I mentioned this, but we have actually 2 teaching and learning platforms going on in the Toronto District School Board. So we have about 5,000 teachers that are only virtual teachers. So virtual school was something that they were able to become a part of. And then we have bricks and mortar teachers. And so, you know, in terms of working with parents in those 2 different platforms, it's very different. You know, sometimes we have parents that are with their students on screen for a lot of the day. So we're having to relate and communicate with parents and community in different ways on different platforms. And I have to say that, you know, when we sit in our homes and we're working remotely supporting members, the thing that gives me the greatest sense of reward and solidarity building with my colleagues that are local leaders is being able to sit and listen to teachers that are working in schools where there are so many infections and where they're stressed and they need to talk about it. They need to tell their stories, and we can troubleshoot that together. So it's about the going in with them as their union rep, as their representative, listening, setting up meetings with them at lunchtime and talking about, you know, how things are going on an equity level in that particular area with that community of parents and in that school, and talk about strategies to build that relationship, so that parents and teachers can continue to come together over the issues that the government isn't providing. So the immediacy and using what we have virtually to connect with parents and communities on our lunch hours. That's how we do it as local leaders, and to make the time for each other so that we can gather strength to be able to provide that to our members. So that's where we are. We have a long way to go, and I'm so inspired to hear from both Cecily and Jen. Thank you.
So we have 2 more questions. I just want to let you know that there are 2 more questions in the prompt. So I'm going to open it up for all of you to talk about the leveraging of parents, but there's also a question that's kind of related. So let me ask this and then go to Jen and Cecily for the answers to both. The second one is, to what extent is a disproportionate amount of trauma experienced by students and educators of color a part of the conversation about, you know, racial justice return? So leveraging parents and, you know, understanding the conditions of students and educators of color. And I'll open it up to, I think, Cecily, let's go to you first and then Jen.
Okay, thank you. So for this, thank you for this question, Erica Taylor. Yeah, we're in the most traumatic moment of our lives, unprecedented. And that's educators as well as students and our communities. And so a part of the conversation is actually getting out the message of a healthy, healing, racially just return. And what that looks like to me, and what I've told my superintendent, is that I actually want to see trauma-informed curricula. I actually want to see social emotional learning happening. And it's, you know, and what I've also countered with the superintendent and district officials, school board members, is what I've said is, damn the test, forget the test. Nobody gives a, you know what, about the test. Those standardized tests, which are racist in its roots, don't let me get started there. But let's really talk about what our babies need to thrive, not just survive. We want them to thrive. And they're going to need art and music and dance and drama, because they've been sitting in their homes with all of the noise and all of that. And they're going to need to do some art and some building, and we've got to be able to do that. And it cannot be measured on a test. So that's what I would say to that. And as far as the parents, we're going to have those parents that are, you know, clamoring to come back in, and they are in the wealthier and healthier communities. And that's always going to be there. Those are going to be the folks that say they're progressive and say they're liberal, but they will, damn it, they will not be supporting funding for public schools. So let's be clear. Let's be clear on that. The other part is with the parent groups, you've got to get parents, that's voices that have not been heard, to come to the fore and have conversations and push them to the media so that they can give their story.
Thank you. Jen, you want to answer that question? And then I'm going to go to the last two.
Sounds good. So I think in Chicago, first, we have to be grounded in the demographics of a large city, right? So while 50% of our educators, our teachers are white, only 10% of our students are white. And that means who's clamoring for return is, just like Cecily just said, disproportionate. And so something between 65 and 70% of our students are staying remote because they have a historical distrust that the school district will serve their kids, because their kids are kids of color who have been in schools without the adequate resources. They're struggling, with unemployment and housing insecurity. And so they are focused on survival and keeping their kids safe. And so the vocal minority of folks clamoring for the wider return can sometimes feel outsized. But the piece that I would also just remind us is that, educators have intersectional identities too. And sometimes we create these barriers between, well, educators are over here and parents are over here. Well, no, some of our educators are parents, and some of our, we have to think about the school staff beyond just teachers, the janitors and the custodians and the lunchroom workers, right? We have to have authentic relationships with those people about their whole lives. And I think that if we're approaching people about our demand to stay remote or to stay safe, and that's the first time we're approaching them and they're a parent or a family member, then we're doing something wrong. It's about building long-term and authentic relationships with folks who aren't employees of the school district, but have students in the school district, right? So we have to have a mutual relationship where our work is not temporary, but our work with them is permanent. And they our fates are tied together, and our identities, right, overlap. We are them and they are us. And then there's obviously a Venn diagram, with different, whatever, you know what I'm saying? So again, I think it's not about leveraging parents. Like, that feels really awful to me to hear it said that way. It's about what kind of authentic relationships we have with the stakeholders that are in our communities where our schools are. One of the things that we won in our last contract was the last two contracts was a new provision for sustainable community schools. And I'm sure people are familiar with the community school model, and it kind of traditionally is about after school programs and food pantries, but we're trying to build a sustainable community school model where it's not just about adding on, it's about community, parents, and students being a part of the leadership of the school, making decisions about the school, about building a culture from inside the classroom to outside of the classroom that is restorative and transformative, where, we're not isolating what's happening in the classroom and what's happening outside of the school building. These things, they should be and necessarily have to overlap and intersect and be driven by one another. So to that effect, the other question was about, are we adequately addressing student and educator trauma in the return? I think we've been lifting up the needs of students as a result of the exacerbated trauma. I don't think educators are getting enough attention in that. I know they've been traumatized because they've lost loved ones. They have lost, I mean, multiple people on CTU's staff have had family members with COVID. Multiple people have had people die, and that's just a staff of 50. Right? So I don't think we are adequately addressing the actual trauma supports that our members are going to need, because, you know, in some ways, rightfully, the emphasis is on our students and their families and communities. But again, we're not separate. We are a part. We are members of our school communities.
We have two more questions. I doubt we get to the last one. So sorry, Rema, but I'm going to just shorten the question and just pose it this way. What is your message to early career educators, those who are hired during the pandemic, who want to roll up their sleeves and do the good work that your unions do? So Joy, we'll start with you, and then one final message, an answer to that question from Jen and Cecily, and then we'll turn it over back to Rhiannon for our final goodbye.
I think that we have to remember that part of our job as union leaders is to continue to do that good work of welcoming, of inviting, of, you know, sharing the realities that we're facing, but also just you know, putting heads together and walking arm in arm and communicating what works. What are our best practices to create those opportunities through online training, seminars, group shares, all of those just webinars that are about communicating and inviting young new teachers with that enthusiasm. I think that we'll find that it buoys us and that we can buoy them and show them that we are taking steps and making progress, and we just have to share our nuggets of gold with one another and draw on one another's energy. So I think it's wonderful that they are stepping up, and we just have to remember that we all need to share that same kind of energy and find our source and our power in solidarity and working together through this, moving through this pandemic.
Thank you, Jen, and then Cecily.
Yeah, so I think, you know, some of this has been dependent on the structures that were built prior to the pandemic. You know, CTU has built up its power over the last decade, I would say, and we've become more visible. And so I think it's more likely, right, that our contract action teams, that our delegates, right, know how to engage new members, even in the virtual space. Like I said, union participation in virtual meetings has been really great. And so I think there's actually been an opportunity for some of those new folks to get engaged more quickly, actually, than they normally would. But it wouldn't be possible if we had not built kind of school site structures and you know, job related structures where you have representatives already in place that kind of know it's their role to welcome new educators into the union. I will say, you know, we have a great committee structure that is always uneven, but I've seen new members rise through some of our committees that have been particularly active, like the Human Rights Committee, which has been doing work on anti-racist curriculum, like our Cops Out of Schools campaign that was working with young people. There were folks in those spaces, right, because of the issues that were being raised that I didn't see in other union spaces. So again, making room for those kinds of topics and issues to have space in the union. And then the last thing I would add is that we got an opportunity through our state union affiliate to start a mentoring program during the pandemic due to the teacher shortage. It's small. It's not going to be massive like they want it to be, because the teacher shortage is going to be really massive, worse than it was before as a result of this. But we chose to focus the mentoring program on Black first-year teachers, because Black teachers have been the ones who have been fired due to turnarounds, layoffs, school closures. And we need to let Black teachers know that they are valued, that we see their assets, that we understand that they need a community of support that doesn't always exist in their school building. And so that was actually an opportunity that came about because of the pandemic that would not have been there now, because legislators finally are like, uh-oh, you know, the teacher shortage is going to get worse. So let's drop some money on mentoring. And we said, great, let's focus on Black teachers.
Cecily.
Thank you for that. All right, thank you for that. We have a racial justice task force, and it started right after Michael Brown's murder in August of 2014. And what I can say to that is it's become such a beautiful space of, you know, in coalition with students, with educators, with psychiatric social workers. So looking at that SEL piece, and community groups like Black Lives Matter LA, Fannie Lou Hamer Institute, and then we have White People for Black Lives. I say that to say many of our young educators, early educators, have come in there and like are on fire. And now taking that, going back to their schools saying, did you know about this? Did you know that our union was doing this? So forth. So they've been the ones, you know, pushing out and in on racial and social justice, and then pushing back up saying, we want more. What else can we do? And that's the reason why, you know, when I took on this presidency July 1 of this year in this pandemic, my focus was really talking about racial equity and how we can work on racial equity within our officers, within our executive board. And then I brought folks from our equity team and folks from our racial justice who are rank and file folks that are getting the information, and we're going through this training together, which I want to see extend to all of the folks in UTLA, because we have got to drastically change where we are. And then, you know, as Jen said, using our contract action teams, or we're calling them now chapter action teams, to really focus on these issues and the bread and butter issues, right? We got to hold on to those, but we also have to bring in the common good, bring in racial justice work, and tie those together so that we can move our union to its next level of transformation.
Thank you. Thank you for your inspiration this evening, for some of you, late afternoon, for all of us. Jen, you said you wanted to share one more thing? Oh, Jen is putting in the chat the demands for improvement to remote learning and recovery. So you can get into the chat and get that information. I'm sure each of these fabulous women of color are open to connecting with all of you here today. I'm just grateful to the SIG for the opportunity to moderate this inspiring group of women, and I'll hand it back to you, Rhiannon.
Thank you so much. So again, this event has been sponsored by the Teachers Work Teachers Union SIG of the American Educational Research Association. Huge round of applause for the panelists. Thank you each so much for your words of wisdom. And thank you so much, Theresa Montano, for facilitating or moderating the session. We really appreciate the care you've taken with this. And thank you, audience. Thank you, everybody, for showing up on late on a Sunday evening. So have a wonderful evening, and thank you again.
And thank you to our two fabulous ASL interpreters. Thank you so much for coming with us from ARA to the Zoom room to keep the interpreting going. We really appreciate it.